Okay, so our prompt today is about the Alien and Sedition Acts. These are laws that were passed under the Federalist Congress and President John Adams. And these laws targeted immigrants. The Alien Act made it harder, took a longer time for immigrants to become citizens because most immigrants tended to be vote Democratic Republican. And the Sedition Acts basically made it a crime for newspapers to criticize the government. Now, those might seem problems in terms of the First Amendment for freedom of speech and that sort of thing, and it is, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So just some context here. Immigrants coming to the United States tended to be sympathetic to the French Revolution. They were typically poor, and they tended to vote Democratic Republican. That led to the passage of these laws. These laws are a way for the Federalists to try and maintain their power. Also, around this time, you have these negative feelings about France. You have the Citizen Genet affair, which Edmond Genet was a French citizen who tried to get Americans to ignore Washington's neutrality proclamation and get them to fight for the French. And that was seen as a kind of a bad move and got a lot of criticism. You have the XYZ affair, where the Americans went to France to negotiate with the French government, but the French officials demanded a bribe in order to talk to the French leadership. And so this made Americans really angry at the French. They felt like the French were corrupt and were not treating the Americans fairly. You also have this quasi-war where you have, it's not actually an actual declared war, but the French ships were capturing U.S. ships and impressing American sailors. It means kidnapping U.S. sailors. So this developed a lot of negative feelings about the French. And we know the Federalists were anti-France. Democratic Republicans tend to be pro-French. So we have Democratic Republican voters here are increasing. We have negative feelings about France are increasing. And so we have the Federalists are gaining power. In the election of 1796, John Adams wins the presidency. And also the Federalists win Congress as well. Okay, so this all sets the scene for the Alien and Sedition Acts. So these laws are passed, and they're anti-immigrant and they're anti-free speech. So we're going to look at how these led to the election of Thomas Jefferson. So first of all, you have state governments fighting back against these laws. You have the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions written by Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And these resolutions basically said that states claimed they could reject any federal law that they didn't like. This becomes a foundation for something called states' rights, which we will talk about more when we get to slavery. Notice how these are two southern states dominated by Democratic Republicans. So they know that these laws are targeting their voters. So they're trying to find a way to make these laws go away. These laws are also unpopular because they're pretty clearly a target on certain people. And so that kind of makes the Federalists kind of lose power. They kind of extended themselves in terms of trying to get their power. So what happens is the Federalists lose power eventually. Thomas Jefferson wins the presidential election of 1800, and the Democratic Republicans control Congress. So we've gone from a complete flip where the Federalists gained power before, and then we have the Adams presidency. These laws are passed, and the Federalists lose, Democratic Republicans win. Okay. However, the Federalists do control the judicial branch, and we'll talk more about this with John Marshall later on. Our third category here is this idea of the testing of the Constitution, right? The election of Thomas Jefferson is a real test of the Constitution, and so are the Alien and Sedition Acts. What I mean by that is you have, for the first time, you have this peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another. I have this backwards, actually, from Federalists to Democratic Republicans. So John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. So that's a big deal because we don't have a revolution or anything. There's an election. It's peaceful. There's no fighting, none of that kind of thing, none of that kind of stuff, right? So this is a big deal. This is kind of proof that the Constitution kind of works. On the other hand, we have a severe limitation of rights. Newspapers cannot criticize the government under the Sedition Acts. And so that seems like to violate the First Amendment. And that won't be the first time that rights are limited. Even though these laws are not really enforced, the fact that they're even passed shows that a willingness to kind of ignore some parts of the Constitution. And also we have this kind of anti-immigrant feeling, which is going to come up throughout American history here. So the Alien Acts are targeting these immigrants. So overall, the Constitution succeeds in some ways with this peaceful transfer of power, but it also fails in others where it doesn't kind of protect the rights that are listed in the Bill of Rights. So these lead to what's called the Revolution of 1800, which is the election of Thomas Jefferson.